It gives me great pleasure to be on this panel with Nadeem, Kamla and Mohsin Hamid. I think you know their work quite well, so I'm going to give you a very brief introduction. Nadeem is launching his fourth novel, The Blind Man's Garden, at the KLF this morning, or has just launched it. And his previous works have been shortlisted for several prizes, including the Impact and the Whitbread. Mohsin Hamid is launching his third novel, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, also this afternoon. And his previous novels have been up for a number of prizes, including the Man Booker Prize for The Reluctant Fundamentalist, which has now been made into a film. There's kind of a lot of conversation here, if you could...
I think a lot of the conversation is from the school children on the side, which we can't do very much about.
Yeah. It's a little noisy, I'm sorry. And Kamla is the author of 5 novels, the most recent of which is Burnt Shadows, and was shortlisted for the Orange Fiction Prize. Now, all these writers are frequently discussed in the context of the 9/11 novel. In fact, I went to a seminar recently. It was called South Asian English Fiction, and actually it wasn't South Asian, it was just Pakistani fiction, and it was largely the Nadeem, Mohsin, and to a lesser extent Kamla, but it was about 9/11, and it was their 9/11 work. And what I really want to bring out here is actually they have addressed political issues from their very first novels, which began before 9/11. And between them, they have discussed some of the most important issues in this country's political history. Beginning with the 1971 Civil War, the rise of extremism in Pakistan, the 1998 nuclear blast, the American presence in Afghanistan, its effect on Pakistan, and of course the events of 9/11 and thereafter. And alongside that, they have addressed much wider issues, which are also political issues, issues of poverty, issues of colonialism, class, race, gender. So the first question actually I would pose to them, and which I would like each of them to say a little bit, it's a group of questions, is what are the links between politics and fiction? When you started to write, how conscious were you of the political issues that would engage in as your characters developed, and what comes first, politics or character or plot? I think we'll begin with Nadeem, because he's at the far end.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here. What I can only... with me, it's always the subject matter as a writer. Various novelists have given various answers to this question. Some say it's the plot line, some say a character appears and I decide to explore him, and then others appear and the whole thing coagulates into a novel. With me, it is always the subject matter. I always say that news is the most emotional program on TV for me. So when I see something on TV and I wish to respond to it, given my character, given my temperament, the only thing I can do is I can write about it, and I am a novel maker, so I write fiction about it. So for me, I wanted to write about honor killings, so I wrote Maps for Lost Lovers. I wanted to write about female infanticides, I wrote Layla in the Wilderness. I wanted to write about Afghanistan, what happened to Afghanistan in the past 20-25 years. So I wrote about, so I made a novel, and I went, so once the subject matter appears, I go looking for characters that would best help me define the complexities within that subject matter, the hope within that subject matter, what the causes might be of the difficulties in that situation. And with The Blind Man's Garden, I wanted to write about what happened to Pakistan in the past 10 years. So for me, it's always the subject matter. And by temperament, I am a political person. Again, I say that I wrote every time, I vote every time I write a sentence. So for me, voting and writing rhyme. So for me, I want politics in my novels, but that might be just my temperament.
For me, the process has changed quite a lot because the first, I suppose, 4 novels, from In the City by the Sea, Salt and Saffron, Cartography, Broken Verses, they all started with something very small. There would be an image or a line and which would just stick in my head, and it became like a sort of sun which other ideas would orbit around, and some of them would attach themselves to it, and a novel would start to form. But again, because I grew up in Karachi, in Pakistan, at a certain point of time, so if I'm writing a novel and it's set in Karachi, and then I ask myself the question, in which year did this happen? Well, what year it happened has a direct bearing on the kinds of lives people are leading. If it's the summer of 1995 in Karachi, a bunch of kids are not going to get into a car and drive out to the beach, because as those of us who remember that time you didn't do that. There was enough tension and danger. If it's the end of 88, that's when Zia ul Haq is killed, and then there's elections for the first time, and so that's in the very fabric of everyday life. And so the political or the historical, it's just, that's the context. But again, like you, it's what I'm interested in. My favorite subjects in school were history and literature. And as storytellers, I think we're also interested in the silences we see and looking for the stories there. And if you grow up post 1971 in the Zia ul Haq years, there are a lot of silences. There are a lot of official silences, and there are a lot of silences in the history texts you're being taught in school. You become aware that you love history, but history stops in 1947 if you're being taught in schools. And if you're interested in everything till 47, and then you want to know what happened after. And if I'm interested in something, the best way I know of finding out more about it is to write a novel about it, because that directs the brain. It makes me go looking for something. It has changed in the last couple of novels. I think I'm now closer to where Nadeem is, which is something larger will interest me, and then I try to find the story. And the first time that happened was with Burnt Shadows, and in fact, it was a conversation with you. That Nadeem and I were at a book launch. It was in 2002, I think, or 3. And this was in London, and someone said, oh, well, everyone will be writing about 9/11 soon. And Nadeem said to me, what's your next thing? And I said, I'm not thinking of 9/11 at all. I've strangely become interested in Nagasaki, but of course I can't write a novel about it because I don't know anything about the place or the history. And he said, well, so you'll find out. And I thought, actually, why not? Let's try it differently. So it did actually, that started with this very large thing, the bombing of Nagasaki, which I had various small reasons for being interested in, but I didn't know of any large reason. And then it became researching and finding an image and a character and a storyline. And because I don't plot, what happened was, it went in directions I didn't expect. I thought I'd be writing a novel that would be primarily about, the primary historical and political context would be Pakistan, India's nuclear standoff. And then Burnt Shadows turned into a completely different novel because as I was researching, things started coming up and ideas were forming and stories and characters were forming that wanted to walk off in other directions. So I let them walk off in those other directions.
Hello. There's a line in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams where he says that the secret to flying is throwing yourself at the ground and missing. And in a way, that's how I write my books. I start my books, my novels, with, I think, a very good idea of what I'm doing. And then two things quickly happen. I completely fail at that idea, and I start to get another idea. Yeah. And this process, takes place over many drafts and several years. And, I sort of, progressively write my novels, less badly each draft. And eventually it winds up as something that seems to work. Now, the way politics comes into it is, I think, in a sense, I was very interested in what Nadeem said, because I actually didn't know that about him, that's how he thinks about starting his novels, that it's the idea. I think I also have, to a certain extent, an idea or some ideas, an issue I'd like to write about, and also I think some elements of what Kamla said, which is that there's some notion that intrigues, there's some place, some characters, and it sort of goes from there. A bit of both of those come together, but it's not that clean for me. It's very hard to identify where the politics comes in. I think what happens is that I start writing, and like Kamla and Nadeem, I'm a political person, and I think of writing as a political act, and I maybe come to understand my politics a little better through the course of writing the book. So my 9/11 novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, the first draft I wrote before 9/11. So it wasn't initially a 9/11 novel. It was just 9/11 happened to it. And but in the course of the 7 years that I wrote that book, I started with a novel that was really about working in the corporate sector in New York, thinking about what it meant to have a job in that type of a environment, and also thinking about whether I should move back to Pakistan and what I was doing living in America. And those were the initial motivations for the book. And so the main character did grow a beard and does come back to Lahore, but he did that in the first draft before 9/11 happened. And I gave it to my agent, and he said, Mohsin, it's fine, it's not great, but also this Muslim guy who has this sense of tension with America, I don't really buy it. And that was July 2001. And then 2 months later, he said, that novel you're working on about the Muslim guy. But then it took 6 more years to do it properly, because 9/11 had, changed the entire calculus and vocabulary and the subject matter. So I suppose, the best way I can answer this is to say that there is a overt political gesture in my writing. It is part of, what I'm doing. But I often don't fully understand it, or it's of most interest to me when I don't understand how I feel about something, and the novel is in a way my attempt to figure it out.
I don't know if you remember this, Mohsin, but actually, Mohsin and I met on the 12th of September 2001, and we'd had dinner a few days earlier, and he'd been talking to me about the novel he was writing, The Reluctant Fundamentalist. And on the 12th of September, the first thing I said to Mohsin was, that book of yours. And he said, I don't know, I think I have to keep going. And I said, you definitely have to keep going. But it was one of the first things that I thought about, because the other thing that happened on the 12th of September was everyone was saying, why do they hate us? And I was thinking, where are the novels out there? Yeah. And I knew you were writing that, and you had already been talking to me about your Afghanistan novel at this point.
Yeah. And of course we're telling our 9/11 stories. One of the things that happened, any number of writers, they are actually on record for saying that when that event happened, they said the novel I'm currently working on is not important, because that's the important thing. And actually my response was, that's the novel I'm not writing. that was there in my first novel, which I published 10-11 years ago. And it's interesting that you say that. And the other important thing Kamila said, that in a certain year kids couldn't go to the beach, etc. But of course there is an impulse behind any number of people who would say, well, actually let's try to write a novel which doesn't include the politics. Sure. And then of course my instinct always is to say to them that even non-political novels are political in that sense. Who are you, and what do you think you can leave out of the conversation? Why are you so privileged that you think this doesn't affect you? So I think we're talking about the political.
I wanted to just go back a bit, because you said you'd started your Afghanistan novel. Where was it, like Mohsin had got his Reluctant Fundamentalist, where was yours going, and what did 9/11 do to it?
Well, this is very important, because when I finished my first novel and I sent it off, I had 2 novels in mind.
What
One
year was that?
Huh?
What year was that?
So this was in 1992,
Yeah.
when the civil war had started in Afghanistan, because the Russians had pulled out, etc., etc., and these beautiful shiny weapons that were channeled into Afghanistan, the warlords now turned them into. So hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people died during that decade in the 90s. You know, millions of lives were trashed. But the narrative in the West was, we won. You know, we won the Cold War. And then my instinct was, back in 1990, what Cold War? It got pretty hot over here in Pakistan, you know. The Cold War was cold only for the privileged places of the planet. You know, the idea is that the policies of the Cold War ensured 40 years of peace. Well, all the blood was spilled over here in the third world. You know, peace was there. So in 1992, I had two ideas for it. One was the Honor Killings novel, and one was, again, I'm talking about a subject. I said, I want to tell Afghanistan's story. What happened in the 80s and what happened. And seriously, I have a feeling I tossed the coin. Because for me, both those, because I was actually living in an immigrant community in England, and also politically I was engaged in what was going on in Afghanistan. I was deeply distressed by what was beginning to happen, and the civil war was the beginning. So I have a feeling, I have a memory that I actually tossed a coin, and Honor Killings won. And during the decade it took me to write that novel, Maps for Lost Lovers, I was also keeping notes. And then 9/11 happened, and there was a novel. So, and I immediately, more or less the next day, when I finished Maps for Lost Lovers, I sat down to write my Afghanistan novel. And then people said that, this is very timely, etc. I said, no. This was not an ahistorical event. 9/11 didn't just come out of the blue, as you said, why do they hate us?
Yeah.
And I said, well, this might be the reason why they hate you. I wanted to go back and tell and remind people what happened in the 90s and what happened in the 80s and what happened in the 70s. That impulse was always there.
Yeah.
And I think if the juggernaut of history and politics is bearing down on you in these places, then surely you would wish to, simply as a human being, wish to respond to it.
I remember you saying at one point that because you already had quite a lot of the plot worked out, and that you had to find a reason for the American character to be back, and
actually,
then,
I had
September
no idea.
11
Yes.
gave you a reason.
In the novel, the American CIA chap originally had to go back, and I was wondering, why does he go back? Why does he go back? And then, of course, like you said, 9/11 happened, and I said, oh, that is why he goes back. You know, I had arranged during the 1990s, a Russian satellite fell into the Canadian steppes with certain amount of nuclear material, which couldn't be left out there in the snow and ice. And the CIA had sent dog teams to go and retrieve that. And now the Taliban were happening and Al-Qaeda was happening. So I said that maybe when they go to retrieve the nuclear material, perhaps somebody from Al-Qaeda is there trying to get the material. That was, I mean, as a novelist, this is what you're trying to do. Find a reason, a plausible enough reason for your character to go back. And then the CIA thinks, who are these guys? Let's go and find out who these guys are. So my American character goes back. But then I said 9/11 happened. And
you were talking about the idea that everything is political, and even when you say things are not political, that's a political act. You know, being from a Pakistani context, what happens is, I think for all of us, it's one of the few generalizations I'm going to make, but I think it's true, is it's very hard to be from a Pakistani context and not be, I'm being attacked by these flies, and not be aware that politics is contested, that things are, you know, I think it maybe is, I don't know, but I would imagine it maybe is easier to grow up in California or Massachusetts or somewhere and think, there's a basic narrative of what my country is about or what the world is about, and you can sort of accept it. It's very hard to do that in Pakistan because it's so obviously contested. You have people blowing themselves up and shooting other people and going into their mosques or their graveyards and killing them, and it's obvious, frighteningly obvious, that we don't agree on what the narrative of Pakistan is or should be. And so I think, one thing which happens is that many Pakistani writers that I've spoken to will say what Nadeem has said and what Kamla has said and what I also believe, which is that, it's just a natural act to write politically. But in other places, it isn't always. People seem to think that, you can write non-political stuff, or politics is not really your thing, or art and politics are separate. And there was a very good essay by Pankaj Mishra about this in The Guardian recently. And what Pankaj was saying was that actually, it was to do with the uproar of this Chinese novelist who had won the Nobel Prize. And they said, well, he hasn't called out the Communist Party and critiqued the Communist Party. And Pankaj said in this article that that while he thought obviously that was a flaw in this person's political the way that he conducted himself politically. We don't say that about American writers. Nobody says that Updike never looked at the growing sort of nuclearization and militarization of America in the 1970s and 80s and challenged that dominant narrative. So I think actually many Pakistani writers, not all, but many Pakistani writers come naturally into this political space because maybe we're unfortunate in a way that our country is so contested, but we are fortunate maybe intellectually or creatively because it has taught us not to believe what we're told and to dispute what we're told. And I think that carries forward very naturally into novel writing, and not just from Pakistan, but from what Nadeem has called all of the places where the Cold War was hot. Everybody from these countries has, I think, lived in a place where it's obvious that the basic narrative of what their country is about is nonsense, and bloody nonsense in the sense that people are dying to contest it. So I feel very at home having a political conversation about the novel and with these novelists, and I think it's almost strange that there are places where that seems odd to have a political conversation about the novel.
I think the other thing is, in this country, one of the questions that, whether explicitly or implicitly, but there is a question that we are all always asking, which is what happened, right? And what happened is a question that is asking for a story. What is the story of what happened here? But the other aspect of it with Pakistan, which is strange and interesting, is there are people here, there may even be one on the panel, who has been alive as long as Pakistan has been alive. Only barely. She wasn't very old, but the fact that you can sit and talk to people who were eyewitnesses to every moment. Obviously not eyewitnesses to every moment, but they either have memories or, importantly, don't have memories of certain key moments. And so you're sitting around and you're hearing about the birth of the nation. That these are also your family stories, are these different points in history. And because of the what happened here question, that people in gatherings are always trying to answer this question by their own memory of, but in 1956 this happened, and in 1963, and they're always trying to thread together a narrative of the nation, and that there are these contested stories you're hearing all the time, but so-and-so said this, but so-and-so said that. And that is, we don't know what the narrative of Pakistan is, but we know that there are a lot of people with very differing views on what it is. And what the novelist is doing is taking that and putting it in the form, this artistic form, which is the novel. But that is, it's an everyday matter. There's no day that goes by in Pakistan where a few million people don't ask the question, what happened? What's the story?
I want to go slightly off fiction because I'm quite intrigued by Reluctant Fundamentalists being made into a film. I haven't seen it, but the novel was full of ambiguities, it was full of subtleties, it kind of engaged the reader. I wondered what the challenges were of putting it into a film, and what does I mean, because a film is a kind of much more, to me, I think it's a much more obvious. How did you tackle it? What does the film say in relation to the book and vice versa?
Well, it's. I had some degree of involvement with the making of the film. So I collaborated on the earliest draft of the screenplay, and then went on to set a few times and met the actors and gave some advice. And I had the dangerous amount of involvement where I can't deny responsibility if it's not good, but I can't take any credit if it actually is good. So it's a different artistic project, really. There's no such thing as a movie of a book. There are just movies that are inspired by books to a certain extent, and they work in very different ways. As you say, it's not. You use the word obvious, and I think it can be obvious. The films can be obvious, but for me the big difference between movies and books is that in a film, much more imagining is done for you. So, when you read Nadim's book or Kamala's novel, what you'll see is written words. And then you imagine those words into people and into events and into emotions, images. Whereas when you watch, a movie, you see it is Brad Pitt, and he is kissing somebody who looks like that. And this is the soundtrack, It is Danger Zone as Tom Cruise speeds forward to shoot down the Russian plane or whatever. So the big difference, I think, is that you are the director in a way, or at least the cinematographer of the movie of your book. I mean, you, the reader, I mean. And so when it comes time to an adaptation, for me as a novelist, it is perplexing, because I'm, the whole point of the Russian fundamentalist, in a sense, is the ambiguity. And if you take that out and you create certainty, in a sense, the project of the novel is undermined by that. But on the other hand, something else wonderful does happen in the film, and I think something wonderful happened in this film, The Russian Fundamentalist, which is that, Kamla, Nadeem, and myself and other writers, we create entirely alone. So we sit by ourselves at a computer for years, and then this novel comes out. And there's a real beauty to that form, and there's something very wonderful and in its own way, I think spiritual about the activity, or meditative, frustrating, but it's solitary. The fantastic thing about watching a movie get made is that it is the ultimate collaborative activity. There are 200 people. I went to this one party they had, some of the crew members were having while they were filming. And there was this guy, and he, he looked, he really looked like he was some hot shot in the film world, and he had this sort of smile, and so I went up and said, so what do you do? I was so impressed by his demeanor, and he looked at me and he said, I'm a focus puller. I didn't know there was such a thing as a focus puller, but a focus puller is somebody who, as the camera is moving, is determining what the film camera will focus on. Because it's not sort of an autofocus thing, you point and they just, the camera can do all sorts of things. So it can look in that direction and it can focus on the lady in the front row, or can focus at that waiter standing in the back. And he is doing that. So there are hundreds of people, carpenters, focus pullers, track layers, sound engineers, makeup specialists, etc. And so, although the film, I think, does not have the same degree of ambiguity as the book, it has something else which is very special, which the book doesn't have, which is it brings together these people from all over the world. This Indian film director, Pakistani novelist, Riz Ahmed, the star, is a British Pakistani actor, famous American actors, Kiefer Sutherland, Kate Hudson, those kinds of people, who are playing a supporting role to the main role of this British Pakistani figure, Turkish actors, Indian actors, crew from all over the world. And so, in making the film, in a sense, is an answer to the political question posed by the book, which is how can all of us on this planet find some modality of coexistence? The film actually is, a beautiful, just as a formal thing, separate from what it looks like on screen, that you'll each judge for yourself. But the film as a project, and as a human endeavor, is a beautiful coming together of precisely the kinds of people from the kinds of places that we believe to be in conflict. So I suppose, the way I relate to the film is something quite different. It's that, it's a little bit like a child. I have a daughter, and she's 3 months old, and every day I think I love her for, reason X, and it turns out that, in a week she's something completely different. And so the film was a bit like that. Is I think, I know what the book is doing for me. Initially I was puzzled that the film was doing something different, and very quickly I realized that it's just a different art form about human collaboration. And when you look at, at the political gesture of a film, it's very important to look at how it's built. And that for me was special.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I was actually thinking of other issues also that the three of you have discussed, which Reluctant Fundamentalist discusses, and in fact all your novels do. It is the politics of gender, the politics of race. These come through. How do you perceive these issues, the politics of, because you've talked about, living in Pakistan where things are blowing up and people are dying, there's Afghanistan, but there's a kind of wider political perspective, and you also address the politics of class and poverty. What Nadeem said, a society should be judged by how it looks after its weak, and you all portray the weak being exploited. What is your approach to gender? Do you have a specific approach to gender or to race? How does it emerge in your kind of imagination and get woven into your novels?
I think you should speak.
I should speak because the word gender has been uttered. The woman.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, you see, that's how it happens.
Yes, men don't have gender.
Well, it's interesting because yesterday I was on a cricket panel with Usman Samiuddin and Saad Shafqat. First, it was fantastic that the two of them, who are two of my favorite cricket journalists, should have thought to invite along a woman, which of course made sense because when I was growing up, my favorite cricket journalist was Farishta Aslam, who was in the audience. So it was a fantastic moment in there. But there was one point when Usman made a point, which is a very good point, where he said, in some ways, cricket is the most democratic thing Pakistan has, because it doesn't matter what your class background is, or where you're in some small mohalla, or wherever you are, everyone plays, and you just, you can go and join in a game regardless, which is true. And then 20 minutes later I said, if you're a man. And Usman said, absolutely, absolutely. But we can make these statements about Pakistan, which are about 48% of its population. And it's not only Pakistan. We live in a patriarchal world, and there are certain kinds of stories that get told more often. You're more likely to hear the stories of the men who went to war than the women who stayed at home, because women who stayed at home are seen as the passive story of waiting, whereas the men are fighting, and that's drama, that's narrative, that's action. So I think the thing that becomes interesting as a novelist is you want to write about all different kinds of experiences, but you also realize that a certain kind of dramatic form is much more given to men's lives. And you don't want your women to be victims all the time. You don't want your women to be the ones who are staying at home. But you also don't want to tell the stories where, typically where you have adventure stories now, or not so much now, but a few years ago, and there was a female character. Very often she would be disguised as a boy. She would be disguised as a boy and she'd get onto the pirate ship. Or she would be the one woman doing all these things with the men. And that's still, it's an improvement, but it's still problematic. And so the question, I think, is always, how do you bring in these stories? How do you, in a world where the dominant forms of narrative and drama are around men's lives and the kind of things men do, How do you write the books that are not seen as women's fiction, but is seen as fiction about human beings of different genders? And there is a real problem actually with the way men read. There have been lots of studies, I don't know in Pakistan if it's true, but I'd suspect it is. In the UK, there have been lots of studies on gender and reading. Women read men and women, men read men. And this is not a guess, it's not an anecdote, this is very, very serious studies have been done. The most popular female writer in Britain is Pat Barker, whose name sounds male, and who writes about the First World War. And so the issues around gender have to do with how are you reaching the male audiences to bring them into these worlds, to say actually the stories by women about women's lives are not, about these cozy domestic female stories that are not really about you. And how to tell these stories and how to talk about these stories in a way that make it clear it's about the human race. And that's something I think that is a real issue for men and women as readers and writers. Yeah.
I mean, I'm frequently surprised by when you talk to male writers that they don't have any favorite female writers. I mean, I can't imagine my reading life, my writing life, and certainly my life without Toni Morrison, without Antonia Bayet, without Louise Erdrich, without these great people. And it was very surprising to read an interview by Juno Diaz, who was the only writer who's actually mentioned male, female, more or less exactly in the same ratio, as it were. And as you said earlier about that in the other session, that there is also a thing called imaginative sympathy, that as a male you can write about female, and of course wanting to tell the truth about humanity, as it were. I mean, I don't sit down to say I'm now going to write about a female character. I now do not going to. And also I think so the politics in the novel, and as I was wondering, novelists, all three of us are novelists here. Do you think our writing would be different if we were non-fiction writers? I mean, could we that this is
it's interesting because you've done columns and you've sort of done short.
Well, both of us have. Nadeem is the interesting one because you're the more atypical person. You're the one who doesn't write the non-fiction stuff. It's why? I mean, not why as in, God damn it, Nadeem.
No, it's a very good question.
Yeah.
I mean, you did read yesterday something that was non-fiction.
Yes, because it's me. Right. I am at the center saying, these are my opinions, these are my memories. I've done it, I think I've written 3 or 4 non-fiction pieces, one of which I read the other day, and I've always been terrified afterwards, and ashamed, embarrassed, because I am talking about myself. And I think that is my character. I'd rather not do it. I'd rather give somebody else my memories, and which is fiction. I think.
I think on this.
And how do you overcome that?
Well, it's an interesting one. I mean, there's. I think there is a kind of novelist stage fright, which is that it's one thing to put a work of fiction into the world, which is a deeply personal thing. But it is different to write from your own vantage point, and because there's no such thing as a right novel, but there really is only such the only type of nonfiction is wrong nonfiction, in the sense that all nonfiction is inevitably flawed. You try to get at something and express what you believe, and you're never going to quite get it. So just how much you fail by. Yeah. And many times I do look back at things I've written and say, what an idiotic. I wish I hadn't. I wish I hadn't said it, but look at how much I've grown that I can look back at what I did and think this is complete nonsense.
But I do find that the novels feel much more personal. I mean, I don't care what someone says about my non-fiction, or it appears today, it disappears tomorrow, no one reads it, it makes no difference to my life whatsoever.
I think that's right. I mean, they don't last the same way that novels do. But the other thing which is very interesting, which you were both talking about on this gender point, is I think novelists have a very interesting relationship to gender, because the act of novel writing is in many ways a kind of sort of imaginatively sort of bisexual and transgendered thing, in the sense that you have to imagine as a man what it is to be a woman, and to be in love, to be angry, to be whatever, and same as a woman writer. You cross imaginatively, I think, this gender boundary all the time. And that's why I was really struck by what you both said, which is that although as a job we sort of cross-dress in a gender sense, it is true that most male novelists that I know, and I'm one of them, read more male writers than female writers. It's not that I don't have my favorite female writers, I have many. And in the last year, maybe I've actually read more women than men. But generally speaking, over my life, it's certainly been the case that I've read more men than women. And so I find it interesting and perplexing that should be going on, even though I would like to think that from professionally, we're somewhat inoculated against that reading bias, but clearly many of us, including myself, retain some of that reading bias.
Are you able to say what happened during the course of last year? Why did you start reading women?
No, I don't think. I mean, it's
accident. Okay.
Well, yeah, I think.
Sure.
I think. I've always read women writers, but for whatever reason, the last book I read was by Sheila Heti, and the book I gave out most last year was Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. So it just maybe happened to be the last 12 months there were more. I mean, I don't only read men, but I would say there has been definitely a ratio where I've read more men than women.
Forgive me, I thought you were teaching a course or something.
Oh, no. It was just like that.
I thought we should open it out to the floor for the last few minutes. Do we have someone with a microphone? There's a question over there in the red sweater.
If you've got politics, how do you do it without taking a political side? How do you write a novel without...
Exactly. The central idea is indifferent to the politics taking part in the story, but the politics does affect the outcome in the story. So how do you avoid getting caught up in the politics? That is the question.
How do you avoid getting caught up in the politics if politics is in the story?
Okay, that's a very good question. If you would allow me, I would like to remind you of William Faulkner's Nobel Prize speech, which is 4 paragraphs long, and he gave it in 1950. And may I read something from it? I always carry it with me.
Okay. Yes, that's great.
Okay. Our tragedy today is a general and universal physical fear, so long sustained by now that we can even bear it. There are no longer problems of the spirit. There's only one question: when will I be blown up? Because of this, the young man or woman writing today has forgotten the problems of the human heart in conflict with itself, which alone can make good writing, because only that is worth writing about, worth the agony and the sweat. He must learn them again. He must teach himself that the basest of all things is to be afraid, and teaching himself that, forget it, forever, leaving no room in his workshop for anything but the old verities and the truths of the heart, the universal truths, lacking which any story is ephemeral and doomed, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. Unless he does so, he labors under a curse. He writes not of love, but of lusts, of defeats in which nobody loses anything of value and victories without hope, and worst of all, without pity or compassion. His griefs grieve over on no universal bones, leaving no scars. He writes not of the heart, but of the glands. Now, yes, great words by a great writer. However, now you would say that when I say that I want politics to be at the center of my works, or be a presence in my works, you would say that I'm going against the words of my master, who's saying, forget about politics, forget about being blown up. But ultimately, this background of politics, this background of history, is lowered, and we are left with the characters who love and hate, and who pity each other, and who wants pity, etc., etc., which is what a novel is. So you say, how do you let
Stop politics from getting in the way.
Because you're writing a novel. Yeah. You're actually saying to people that within the context of all this are real human beings.
It is a beautiful form, the novel, and it is a form that demands that you have stories and characters at the heart of it. And there are certain things then, if they don't happen, it becomes a bad novel.
Yeah. I mean, I keep saying that, novelists don't tell you what to think. They tell you what to think about. So get the stories and place them next to each other, and the reader can make up his or her mind as to which side they might be on. Or he's wrong, no, she was wrong, no, he was right.
No,
go ahead.
Yes.
No, let's go to the next question. I was going to say something on this, but I think it's been very well handled by the two of them. And I'm going to raise your Faulkner with another Douglas Adams quote next.
There's a question here, yes.
I was just absolutely awed by the prescience of writers. Are you not yourself sort of stunned by the fact that something that you've done in this sort of your solitary eyrie, written something which then comes to pass? I mean, how do you then slough off this sense of this Parnassian height? Do you know what I mean? You've seen something that's going to happen, a Cassandra-like, a prophet-like kind of vision, and then it happens. How do you slough that off and become the writer without, do you know what I mean? Aren't you awed by this power that you have? How do you go back to just writing and correcting and then rewriting and then just becoming this little almost mute voice?
I think my festival can end now.
Yeah, really. You are Cassandra.
Fantastic. Yes, exactly. From Olympus, it's very hard to come down among you common people. No, it's not like that at all. I think we're sausage bakers. And so if you go in the factory and you see the animal being chopped up and made into its thing, it doesn't feel like what you're saying. I mean, for me, my job is, figuring out how to make a sentence work, or where the hell this comma should go. Or I've used this word, in the first chapter of the book, and can I use it again? It's very, very, I think, so there isn't really there's, I think the view that you've expressed of what it is like to be a writer is, I wish that were my experience of what it is like to be a writer. But something is going on, and it's not just that you're working in a factory of words and you're swinging your hammer and cracking things. For me, and I think for many writers, there is a kind of a trance that you are in also. But like any trance or meditation or sport endeavor, those moments occur, but they are the product of a great deal of toil and training, and months, years even, can go by where you don't have one. I mean, there's definitely months pass where I just don't feel that that my writing is working at all, and so it's perhaps there are tiny moments where something of the sentiment that you've expressed is how I could say that I feel that there is this something, and that's the aspiration, but it's it's also much more mundane a lot of the time. Now that said, I think it is very important for me personally, as a human being. When I don't write, I become very unhappy, and my wife will sometimes tell me, you need to start writing again because you're just a nuisance. And so there is something, some self-healing or self-acceptance or whatever that is going on. But you know, it is as much somebody with a bad knee, you know, doing physiotherapy so their knee won't hurt them, as it is a kind of, you know, enlightened, wondrous, beautiful thing.
But I think the other thing, to go back to the Cassandra point, and it's to take nothing away from any of the writers who've been writing the great stories going on. But as Nadeem said, you know, 9/11 didn't start on 9/11.
Yeah.
If Nadeem is writing about Afghanistan, it's because the story was already unfolding. And I
Yes.
think if you know, one of the great books that I always have near me is Interviews with Iqbal Ahmed, the great, much lamented Iqbal Ahmed by David Barsimian. There is practically nothing going on in the world today that Iqbal wasn't talking about in the 90s. And I think this is what, you know, as writers and thinkers, you look at the stories that people aren't paying that much attention to. Having said that, I did have one of those goosebumpy moments, which is I'm writing a novel which is set in Peshawar in 1915 and 1930. And I was writing about an excavation at Shaji Ki Dheri, where the Kanishka Stupa was, which was excavated in 1911. And the excavation was leveled in 1919, completely covered and lost. I mean, no one had any idea of where, they didn't keep maps of where it was. And I was writing a book about an excavation at Shaji Ki Dheri. And as I was writing it, I was about a year into writing it, I looked in the Dawn one day and they said Shaji Ki Dheri rediscovered. And you know, so there are these moments as a writer where you just, something extraordinary happens in the world that is, you know, coming into your work.
Yeah. And I mean, the first part of your question, how do you feel? I mean, I don't know a single thing. I don't know anything. But the other thing is, someone said to Faiz Ahmed, Faiz, आपकी शायरी 30 साल बाद हो गए हैं, 30-40 साल हो गए, it's still relevant. And he says, it's nothing to do with the greatness of my poetry. हालात ही नहीं बदल रहे. So this is, so you know, things are not changing. So this is why I think when we speak of great art, we always say it in the present tense, in that Ahab is the captain of the Pequod. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Jewel is the secret son of Adi Bundren in As I Lay Dying. So I think the universal issues, they stay the same, and this is why those ancient stories, beginning with the Greek myths and fairy tales, etc., this is why they are still relevant, because the basic issues, you, me, her, this, a knife, love, a rose, these things stay the same. So if you're keeping an eye on it, as Kamila said, and as most, if you're keeping an eye on certain things, because of what you have been told, how a fable works out, you think, you know, this possibly might be where it's going. So this is how it happens. Yeah.
Well, have we got time for one more question? Or
Can I ask a question?
one. There was
Can I put
There's someone
my
with
question,
the,
please?
there's someone with the
Oh.
mic there.
Can I put my question, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Okay,
Okay.
yes, please. Okay.
Okay. I've recently finished my research on two of your novels, rather H.M. Naqvi's novel as well. I've just worked on that. And there are certain conclusions that I've come up with, and I'd like you to just comment on what we have been discussing in this forum. You have, we have discussed that political thrillers and the political novel has emerged in the post 9/11 world, and we cannot do anything. We cannot just leave it aside. And one thing, and the other thing is that you talked about the gender issues. Now, what I have felt, and through my research also, that the political thrillers, obviously you cannot escape your milieu, you cannot escape your surroundings. And the other thing is that this what was the other thing? I just said about genderless. What I have come up with, I'd like you to comment upon this, that the focus of today's novel has shifted from gendered issues and genderless, and I think that it has become more genderless, whether it be because one is Kamila Shamsi's novel that I've taken, Burnt Shadows. I've taken Burnt Shadows, yours is Reluctant Fundamentalist, and H.M. Naqvi's as Homeboy. These are the three novels that I've researched upon, and I find no difference, and I find that it has become almost genderless regards your character, regarding your characters and all.
Can you
so
just
what do you say to this, that is it
Are your novels
you go
genderless?
beyond gender issues.
I think
and it has become more political.
Thank
gender
you.
is deeply political, so I
Thank
don't
you.
see how you can separate the two. But I think Mohsin answered that question very well earlier when he talked about the novelist as being sort of transgender, bisexual, everything.
Yeah.
That you shouldn't be able. V.S. Naipaul made this contentious statement. Oh, I can tell writing by a woman within 2 sentences, and of course that's nonsense. And you shouldn't be able to know a writer's gender by reading the work, and the job of the writer is to inhabit the different skins. And I don't think that makes it genderless. I think the books are very much about gender, and a woman is a woman and a man is a man,
Yeah, that's
and
true.
all that. But writers need to be transgender.
Yeah,
And I think the other thing is that when I read Nadeem and Kamla's books and other writers that I admire, one thing which often happens to me, and I think usually happens to me in novels that I love, is that the thing that I think maybe is uniform, because I haven't thought about it much. Let's say the family living in northern England from Pakistan, for example, quickly resolves itself as you look at it into not being a single thing but a constellation of different things, and each of those constellations, as you look more closely at, is itself a cloud. And so this idea of things becoming more diffuse and less clearly one thing is in all the fiction that I admire, and it also, I think, applies to just even using the word gender. There is the visibly evident aspect of it, that you can say that Kamla is a woman and I'm a man and Nadeem is a man, but beyond that, what is a woman, what is a man, that is a very blurry thing. So if you want to say that if you're saying that to you writing feels that it partakes of a certain genderlessness, that in a way makes sense to me, because of course there is the political issues associated with being a woman, but in terms of a human being who creates a work of art, there's a it's a cloud. Women writers are not a thing, and male writers are a cloud, and those clouds commingle. So in that sense, I wouldn't disagree. But what do I know? I mean, everybody has their own view, and yours is certainly.
But I think that the focus has shifted towards politics, and politic novels have emerged.
Okay.
Well, do you
both.
want to address
Nadeem?
this issue?
I don't think to make a separation between the novel of politics and the novel about gender, I don't see any such separation at all existing possible.
Can
This
I
is
ask
what
a
my
question here?
was.
Yeah.
Well,
One last question, please, from here.
okay. Have we got time? One very quick question,
Okay, quick
please.
question. Pakistan is fragmenting, and so we live in a certain fragment of society, as do you. So as writers, are you, since there's so much fragmentation going on, are you making an effort to explore the other fragments other than the ones you live in?
Sure.
Is that something that you try to do? And
Absolutely. I mean,
I think all of us in our work.
Well, I think definitely Nadeem and Kamla have written.
No, you
about-
have to.
No, but I think more, perhaps more than I have.
You're rising.
Yeah, the new novel I
the
have.
new novel, right.
But in their
How
books,
to get filthy rich and rising Asia.
yes,
Getting
yes.
done-kissed.
But I think in their novels, you will see all types of people in all types of countries doing all sorts of things,
Yeah,
and
I
it
mean-
certainly hasn't been the case that they've written about people from just socio-economic groups similar to their own.
Absolutely.
I've done more of that, but I'm trying to do less. I'm following in their footsteps, only because I've gotten a little bored, I guess, doing the same thing over and over again.
I mean, I was in my last novel, The Wasted Vigil. There were no Pakistanis. There were Afghanistanis, Russians, Americans, British, and seriously, I have to say that in my mind, they were all Pakistani. In that the basic issue was that I was interested in. I mean, if you blindfolded me and you blindfolded a Russian person and you fed us milk, we would both say this is milk. If you fed us bread, we would identify it as bread. So, I mean, Does that make sense? So for me, those are the basic issues, and then beyond that, you can go and talk about, which is not to say that, once again, this is a session about the politics and etc. Et there are things which you can go and find out. What the history of Russia might be like, what the politics of Russia at any given moment might be like. You might make mistakes, but then if you enter someone's history, and this is not me saying that this is a bourgeois individual who thinks he can breeze into anyone's history and make anything he can do with it. No, you enter other people's stories and histories from a position of humbleness, and you say, let me try to understand this.
I heard, I was at a festival a few weeks ago, and the Irish writer Colin McCann said, people are always told, write what you know. And he said, actually, I think we might be wise to say to aspiring writers, write toward what you want to know.
There you go.
I think that's very much something
Yes.
that,
Well, I have to interrupt because we could go on a lot with this question. Thank you all very much, and thank you, my three panelists. That was really most interesting. Oh, and there will be a book signing. All three of them will now be book signing. Where? Liberty? I'm not sure where, but anyway, follow them and you'll find out where. Thank you very much.